Have you ever felt like no matter how much effort you put into a relationship, the other person keeps their distance? That cold, distant behavior can leave you frustrated, questioning yourself, and even doubting if love is supposed to feel like this. What if I told you that avoidant partners, no matter how distant they seem, have a breaking point? And when you understand exactly what triggers it, everything changes. Avoidants often push people away because deep down they fear losing control. They are masters at creating emotional distance, keeping others just close enough to care, but far enough to protect themselves. But here's the truth. Avoidants crumble when they realize you are no longer emotionally available to them in the same way they were used to controlling. When you stop chasing, stop over-explaining, and start prioritizing yourself, the dynamic shifts. Suddenly, they are the ones chasing, wondering why their usual tactics no longer work. They begin to question their own feelings and, in many cases, realize they've underestimated the value of what they were pushing away. This isn't about manipulation. It's about reclaiming your own power and showing that you won't bend for someone else's insecurities. The moment you establish clear boundaries, embrace your independence, and nurture your self-worth, avoidants feel an undeniable shift. It's in this moment that they truly notice what they risked losing. They realize that the person they were trying to control is now living fully, confidently, and without dependence on their approval. And in that realization, they often crumble, not because you wanted them to, but because you stopped letting them have control over your emotions. This is a powerful lesson for anyone in a relationship with an avoidant. The key isn't to chase, beg, or fight for attention. The key is to focus on yourself, your growth, and your happiness. Avoidants crumble, not when you push harder, but when you finally stop letting them push you around. And when that happens, the power dynamic shifts, clarity emerges, and true connection becomes possible. So the next time you feel yourself bending over backward for someone who keeps their distance, remember, your worth is not dependent on their validation. Stand tall, live fully, and let your independence do the talking. Avoidants always crumble when they see you thriving without them. Avoidants fear losing control, and this fear is often the hidden force behind their distant behavior. It's not that they don't care or that they're incapable of love, but their way of navigating relationships is rooted in a deep need to protect themselves from vulnerability. When someone becomes too close or emotionally demanding, they instinctively pull back. This isn't about punishing you. It's about managing their own internal discomfort. The closer someone gets, the more exposed they feel, and that exposure triggers a need to regain control over their emotional environment. They may appear aloof, detached, or even indifferent, but in reality, every action is a carefully constructed attempt to maintain a sense of safety. This fear of losing control can manifest in subtle ways, like disappearing for periods without explanation, avoiding serious conversations, or creating emotional distance when things start to feel too intimate. They might say things that seem cold or dismissive, not because they don't care, but because the intensity of connection challenges their ability to feel safe. The paradox is that while they fear closeness, they also crave connection. They want intimacy, but only on terms that allow them to feel in control. Understanding this dynamic is crucial for anyone involved with an avoidant partner because it helps reframe what might feel like rejection or indifference. Their distance is rarely about you personally. It's about their own internal struggle. Avoidants often grew up in environments where emotional needs were inconsistently met or where vulnerability was discouraged. This history teaches them to rely on self-sufficiency and to guard against emotional dependence. Consequently, when a relationship demands openness and trust, they experience internal tension and may react by withdrawing. The key point is that avoidants are highly sensitive to perceived threats to their autonomy. When they feel cornered, pressured, or overly dependent on someone else for emotional stability, it triggers anxiety, and their instinct is to regain control by stepping back. It's not manipulation in the traditional sense, it's a coping mechanism. Recognizing this fear of losing control allows you to respond differently. Instead of chasing, arguing, or demanding reassurance, it becomes more effective to create space while maintaining your own emotional strength. When you respect their need for autonomy without compromising your own, it sends a subtle signal that you are steady, confident, and not easily swayed. Ironically, this calm, grounded presence can help them lower their defenses over time because it removes the pressure they fear. They begin to realize that closeness doesn't have to mean losing control. Their fear of losing control is deeply rooted, but when met with patience, self-respect, and consistency, it can soften. The dynamic shifts not because you force them to change, but because they see that intimacy can exist without, triggering the overwhelming sense of vulnerability they dread. Chasing an avoidant almost always backfires because it reinforces the very behaviors you're trying to change. When you over-explain, over-apologize, or constantly seek reassurance, you unintentionally confirm their belief that closeness equals pressure. Avoidants are highly sensitive to the idea of losing control, and when someone chases them, it creates an invisible tension that they instinctively resist. The more you push, the more they pull away, not because they don't care, but because the intensity makes them feel trapped. It's like trying to hold water in your hands. The tighter you squeeze, the faster it slips through your fingers. Overcompensation often takes the form of bending over backward to please them, adjusting your schedule to their needs, or constantly monitoring your words and actions to avoid conflict. While this may seem like a way to earn their affection, it inadvertently signals that your emotional state is tied to their behavior. Avoidants pick up on this, and it reinforces their pattern of withdrawal. Ironically, the more you seek closeness through chasing, the more you distance yourself from your own emotional power, which is exactly what avoidants are wired to detect and respond to. They don't enjoy feeling controlled, even subtly, and chasing creates a dynamic where they unconsciously feel cornered. This dynamic is often frustrating for those on the receiving end because it feels like nothing they do is enough. Yet the problem isn't about effort, it's about approach. Avoidants require a different kind of strategy, one that doesn't rely on pursuit or pleading. The key is to shift the focus from chasing to self-containment. When you maintain your independence, focus on your own life, and live fully without relying on their approval, the invisible tension dissolves. Suddenly, instead, feeling pressured, avoidants begin to notice your confidence, your boundaries, and your self-respect. This isn't manipulation, it's simply refusing to participate in the unhealthy push-pull dynamic that usually governs avoidant relationships. They begin to see that they cannot control your emotions or dictate the pace of your attachment. Ironically, it is in this space of not chasing that they often start to pursue, because humans naturally respond to absence, mystery, and self-assuredness. Chasing might give a temporary sense of closeness, but it ultimately strengthens the avoidant pattern. When you step back, focus on yourself, and stop overcompensating, the balance shifts. Avoidants may initially resist, but over time, they begin to respect your boundaries and see your worth. The lesson is clear: seeking control through chasing never works. True influence over an avoidant comes from embodying your own stability, living authentically, and demonstrating that your emotional world does not depend on their approval. This subtle shift in approach changes the dynamic entirely, transforming frustration into a space where real connection can eventually flourish without pressure or pretense. Self-worth is the cornerstone of any healthy relationship, and when dealing with avoidance, it becomes even more crucial. Avoidants are highly attuned to insecurity and neediness, whether conscious or unconscious, and they often pick up on subtle cues that someone is overly dependent on their approval or validation. When your sense of self is tied to their attention, they unconsciously detect it, and it reinforces their instinct to pull away. The more you compromise your own identity to accommodate them, the more you reinforce the very patterns you wish would change. This is why focusing on your self-worth is not just beneficial, it is transformative. When you understand your value and carry yourself with confidence, it communicates something far more powerful than words. That your emotional state is independent, that you are complete on your own, and that you do not need constant reassurance to feel whole. This shifts the dynamic entirely because avoidants who thrive on control and distance are suddenly faced with someone who cannot be easily influenced or manipulated. They notice the boundaries you set, the passions you pursue, and the life you live outside of the relationship, and this naturally draws their attention in a way that chasing never could. Building self-worth requires consistency and practice. It's about knowing your strengths, embracing your imperfections, and refusing to tolerate behavior that diminishes your value. It is not about arrogance or dismissiveness, but about creating an internal foundation so stable that their behavior, whether distant or present, does not destabilize you. When an avoidant sees that you are grounded in your self-respect, they experience a subtle but undeniable shift. Your confidence becomes magnetic because it removes the emotional pressure they unconsciously fear. Instead of feeling the need to escape, they begin to wonder about the source of your calm and stability. Over time, this can lead them to question their own avoidance patterns and recognize what they risk losing. Importantly, self-worth is not about changing the other person. It's about transforming your relationship with yourself. When you focus on your growth, your goals, and your happiness, you become less reactive and more discerning in how you engage with them. You are no longer chasing validation. You are offering genuine connection from a place of strength. This creates a dynamic where the avoidant is drawn toward authenticity and independence, qualities they often admire but fear, the moment they sense that your life is thriving in depe. Ently of their presence, it can trigger reflection, self-awareness, and sometimes even a softening of their distance. Self-worth changes the game because it allows you to navigate the relationship without fear or desperation. It empowers you to maintain your boundaries, protect your emotional energy, and demonstrate that you are not defined by anyone else's behavior. When you operate from a place of genuine self-respect, the power balance naturally shifts, making it impossible for the avoidant's usual tactics to dominate the relationship dynamic. Boundaries are one of the most powerful tools you can use when dealing with avoidant partners, and they often serve as the trigger that makes avoidants truly notice and reconsider their behavior. Avoidants are accustomed to a dynamic in which they hold the emotional reins, subtly dictating the pace and intensity of the relationship. When you suddenly establish clear, consistent boundaries, it disrupts their usual pattern and forces them to confront something they may have never experienced, a partner who cannot be manipulated or emotionally swayed. Boundaries can take many forms. It may mean declining to engage in arguments that drain your energy, refusing to chase them when they pull away, or prioritizing your personal life and needs above the constant pull of their attention. Every boundary you set communicates that you value yourself, that your emotions are not at their disposal, and that your presence is not conditional upon their approval. This revelation can be jarring for an avoidant because it challenges the power dynamic they rely on. They begin to see, perhaps for the first time, that their usual strategies of creating distance, testing loyalty, or evading emotional intimacy no longer guarantee control over the relationship. It forces them to pause and reflect on what they might be losing. Importantly, setting boundaries is not about punishing the avoidant or trying to make them change on command. It is about reclaiming your emotional sovereignty and living on your own terms. When they witness this self-respect in action, they may initially react with resistance or withdrawal, but over time the effect is profound. Avoidants often crumble in the face of genuine, unwavering boundaries because it reveals that their usual tactics of emotional distancing, subtle manipulation, or avoidance are ineffective. They start to recognize that the person they once thought would bend, chase, or compromise endlessly is now standing firm, living fully, and refusing to be controlled. This creates an entirely new dynamic where their fear of loss is activated, and curiosity about your independence begins to grow. Boundaries also communicate consistency, and avoidants respect consistency more than they admit. When your words, actions, and limits align, it removes confusion and forces them to face reality. Your life and emotions are not up for negotiation. In essence, boundaries make you unshakable, which is both intimidating and magnetic to an avoidant. It's in this space that they often begin to reevaluate their own behavior, question their emotional patterns, and consider the value of the connection they previously took for granted. Clear boundaries create a mirror, showing them the consequences of their avoidance and the potential loss if they do not engage differently. Over time, these boundaries can soften the avoidance distance, not through force, but through respect for your autonomy and acknowledgement of your self-worth. The more consistent and grounded your boundaries are, the more they crumble under the realization that your emotional world cannot be controlled or dictated, which is the exact catalyst that shifts the relationship dynamic, thriving in your own life without relying on an AV. Avoidance validation is the most effective way to influence the relationship dynamic and create genuine attraction. Avoidants are naturally drawn to people who have their own stability, passions, and confidence, because these qualities signal independence and emotional resilience, things they often lack or struggle to maintain themselves. When you stop trying to manipulate outcomes, stop seeking constant reassurance, and stop bending your life around someone else's patterns, you automatically shift the power dynamic. This doesn't mean ignoring them or being cold. It means prioritizing your own growth, happiness, and well-being. Thriving requires an active commitment to your personal goals, interests, and social connections. It means spending time with friends who uplift you, pursuing hobbies that excite you, and dedicating energy to self-improvement and personal fulfillment. When avoidants observe this, they start to realize that your world does not revolve around them, which is something many have never experienced. This realization can trigger a sense of respect and curiosity, even a subtle fear of loss, because they begin to understand that they cannot control your emotions or dictate your availability. Thriving also means embodying confidence in your everyday interactions. It's about walking into a room, engaging fully with life, and expressing yourself authentically without seeking validation from anyone, especially someone who has been emotionally distant. Avoidants are deeply sensitive to authenticity, and they recognize when someone is grounded and self-sufficient. This natural magnetism draws them in, often without a word being spoken. Furthermore, thriving includes setting and maintaining healthy emotional boundaries. By refusing to tolerate disrespect, manipulation, or unnecessary games, you communicate that your energy is valuable and that connection must be mutual and respectful. Avoidants may initially resist or push against this because it challenges the patterns they are used to, but over time, the consistency of your presence combined with your independence shifts their perception. Thriving is about creating a life that is so rich and fulfilling that your emotional state is not contingent on their behavior. It's about demonstrating through action that you are whole on your own. Ironically, when you are least focused on trying to change or win over an avoidant, they are often most drawn to you. They begin to see what they risk losing and, in some cases, reassess their avoidance patterns. The key is that thriving is not about manipulation or games. It is about embodying your value, maintaining integrity, and showing that your life is complete, vibrant, and fulfilling. Avoidants crumble not because you demand their attention, but because they recognize that your emotional world cannot be controlled. And that realization shifts the dynamic entirely. Thriving becomes the silent, powerful force that transforms the relationship from frustration and chase to one where respect, curiosity, and genuine connection can emerge. In conclusion, understanding avoidance and the dynamics at play is not about changing them, but about reclaiming your own power, confidence, and self-worth. By prioritizing yourself, setting clear boundaries, and thriving independently, you naturally shift the dynamic and create the space for genuine connection. Remember, your value is not determined by someone else's approval, and the strongest influence you can have is simply living fully and authentically. Thank you for taking the time to listen, reflect, and invest in yourself. Your journey toward empowered, balanced relationships starts here.